He faced the greatest Muslim commander in history, and won. In 1191 AD, Richard the Lionheart led 12,000 Crusaders against Saladin's unstoppable army, and turned the desert into a killing ground that shocked both east and west. The sun over the Holy Land burned like a curse. 12,000 Crusaders marched along the coast, their armor gleaming, their throats dry, their faith the only thing heavier than their steel. The air shimmered with heat. To the east, dust clouds followed them, not from wind, but from an army shadowing their every step. Saladin watched from the hills, his black banner fluttering above him. His army of 30,000 swift horsemen, archers, and the elite Mamluks moved like a living tide, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Let the Franks march," he said to his emirs. "They will die 1 mile at a time." Below, the Crusaders kept formation, knights in the center, infantry guarding the flanks, the baggage train crawling behind. Every day was a fight for survival. Arrows fell like rain. Men collapsed from thirst before ever drawing a sword. Yet the man at the head of the column never slowed. Richard Plantagenet, King of England, the Lionheart. Tall, broad-shouldered, his red hair blazing beneath his helmet. He rode with his knights of the temple and hospital, his banner, the 3 golden lions, whipping in the desert wind. He had come not to survive, but to conquer. After the disaster at Hattin 4 years before, where Saladin had annihilated the Crusader kingdom, Richard had sworn to reclaim the Holy Land. "Every step toward Jerusalem," he told his men, "will be paid in fire and blood, theirs or ours." Each day, Saladin's horse archers swarmed the column, loosing volleys of arrows and vanishing before the knights could charge. The Crusaders' shields were pitted with shafts. Their horses bled from wounds that never healed. But Richard refused to break formation. His voice was iron. "Hold the line. When I give the word, then we strike." By the time they reached Arsuf, north of Jaffa, the men were half dead with exhaustion. And there, on September 7th, Saladin finally made his move. The desert went silent, and then the thunder of hooves rose like the wrath of God. The Battle of Arsuf had begun. Dawn broke over Arsuf, and the horizon shimmered with the dust of 1,000 hooves. Saladin's army spread across the dunes like a dark sea. Waves of cavalry, banners snapping in the wind, curved swords glinting like fire. His plan was simple: choke the Crusaders between the desert and the sea, wear them down, and break them before they reached the safety of Jaffa. From his white horse, Saladin watched the Christian column crawling south along the coastal road. Their banners gleamed, the red cross of the Templars, the black and white of the Hospitallers, and at the center, the gold lions of England. "They look strong," said one of his emirs. Saladin smiled. "So does a fortress, until you find the cracks." He ordered his vanguard forward. Horns blared. Thousands of mounted archers swept down from the hills, loosing clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. The first volley struck the Crusader rear like rain against metal. Horses screamed. Men staggered, shields rattling. Richard's command rang out, "Hold the line! Not one man breaks ranks." His army advanced in perfect order, infantry outside, knights within, the baggage train sandwiched between. The formation was slow but deadly, a moving wall of shields, spears, and discipline. Every time the Saracens closed in, the crossbowmen fired back, bolts punching through mail and flesh. Saladin's plan was working, almost. He had ordered his men to attack constantly, never allowing rest, forcing the Crusaders to fight thirst, exhaustion, and fear. The rear guard, commanded by the Templars and Hospitallers, took the worst of it. Arrows fell endlessly. Men collapsed under their shields, and still the enemy came. A Hospitaller knight, his armor smoking from the heat, turned to his commander and shouted, "We're being slaughtered, let us charge." "Not until the king gives the word," came the answer. But Richard remained silent. He knew Saladin wanted him to lose control, to scatter his army across the open plain where the Huns' descendants would tear them apart. So he waited. Hour after hour, the column crawled through dust and blood. Arrows struck without end. Men fell, but the line never broke. Saladin watched, frowning. Why won't he charge? Because Richard was waiting for him to make the first mistake. And when that mistake came, it would destroy Saladin's pride and his army with it. By midday, the sun had turned the air into fire. Armor burned against flesh. The taste of dust and iron filled every mouth. The Crusader columns staggered forward, silent but unbroken. Their discipline the only thing keeping them alive. Behind them, the storm gathered. Saladin's horse archers surged again and again, loosing arrows in waves that turned daylight into shadow. The Saracens screamed their war cries, Allahu Akbar, as they darted in and out of range, cutting down the wounded, taunting the knights who dared not pursue. The Templars and Hospitallers in the rear were nearly at their limit. Their shields bristled with shafts, their horses bleeding from dozens of wounds. A young Hospitaller, his face blackened with sweat and dust, turned to his commander. "We'll die standing still," the master of the order growled. "Then we die as men of God." Richard rode near the center of the column, calm as a statue. His chainmail gleamed under the desert sun, his sword drawn but idle. Every nerve in his body screamed to charge, but his mind was steel. He knew the moment he unleashed his knights too early, Saladin's cavalry would scatter like wind and surround them. Patience was his weapon now. Then, at the 9th hour, the storm broke. Saladin ordered a full assault. Thousands of Mamluk heavy cavalry descended like thunder, crashing against the Crusader rear. Spears shattered, men were crushed beneath hooves, and screams drowned the sound of prayer. The Hospitallers had reached their breaking point. Surrounded, bleeding, desperate, they looked to their Grand Master and saw him raise his sword. Charge! Without waiting for the king's command, 100 knights roared forward. Their horses thundered into the enemy ranks, lances leveled, smashing through the Mamluks like a divine hammer. Blood sprayed through the air. The Saracen line wavered, then buckled. Richard saw it and knew the moment had come. He stood in his stirrups and shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now, Knights of Christ, forward!" The entire Crusader army erupted. Trumpets blared, steel flashed, and for the first time that day, the Lionheart unleashed his wrath. When Richard gave the signal, the earth itself seemed to move. 12,000 men, beaten by heat and arrows, roared to life like a single beast. Trumpets screamed, banners whipped through the smoke, and every knight spurred his horse toward destiny. The sound was deafening, hooves pounding like drums of war, lances shattering the wind. The Lionheart rode at the front, his sword raised high, sunlight flashing off his blade. His voice bellowed across the desert, "God wills it!" The Crusader line exploded into motion. The Templars on the right, the Hospitallers on the left, and Richard with the English knights in the center, a wall of iron thundering forward. Saladin's front ranks tried to wheel away, but it was too late. The Crusader charge hit them like a tidal wave. The impact shattered bones and armor alike. Men screamed as the first line of Mamluks was crushed under the hooves of war horses. Richard's sword cut through everything before him, shields, flesh, bone. He rode straight into the heart of Saladin's elite, striking down standard-bearers and captains, his lion banner cutting through dust and chaos. Behind him, the infantry advanced, killing any who tried to flank the charge. Crossbowmen dropped to one knee, loosing bolts at close range into the retreating Saracens. The once fluid army of Saladin was now a storm without wind, scattered, confused, trapped between fury and disbelief. From his hill, Saladin watched the impossible happen. "They charge like madmen," he murmured. "No, like lions." He ordered his guard to counterattack, hoping to break the Crusader momentum. His Mamluks, the finest horsemen in the world, slammed into Richard's knights. The collision sent bodies flying, swords clanging, horses screaming. Richard fought among them, unrecognizable beneath the blood and dust. An arrow struck his shoulder, he snapped the shaft and kept swinging. "Forward!" he shouted. "Drive them back to the desert!" The Crusaders pushed harder. Every man who had survived the long march poured his last breath into the fight. Saladin's elite began to falter, their formation breaking, their confidence fading. When the dust began to clear, the desert was littered with bodies and broken banners. The Lionheart's men still stood, their armor dented, their faces streaked with sweat and victory. Richard raised his sword toward the burning horizon. "Onward to Jerusalem," he said, voice hoarse but steady. And behind him, 12,000 answered with a single cry that shook the heavens. The field of Arsuf was chaos, smoke, blood, and the deafening roar of battle. But Saladin was no fool. Where most commanders would have fled, he adapted. From the dunes beyond the Crusader line, his reserves, 10,000 fresh cavalry, swept forward like a black wave. "Let the Franks think they've won," he said coldly. "Then crush them when they draw breath." The trap sprang. The Hunnic-born tactics of encirclement, lightning strikes, sudden withdrawals, feints within feints, now unfolded with terrifying precision. The Saracen horsemen curved around the Crusader flanks, cutting down stragglers and striking the baggage train. Richard saw it instantly. His moment of triumph teetered on disaster. "They mean to surround us," he shouted. "Knights, reform!" The Crusaders wheeled their horses, forming a new wall of steel. Banners dipped, trumpets blared, and the line bent but did not break. Crossbowmen crouched behind shields, firing into the oncoming riders. Bolts punched through scale and silk. Men tumbled from saddles, trampled by their own. Saladin's personal guard charged next, the Mamluks, the heart of his army. Their curved swords gleamed under the sun as they struck with terrifying speed. The clash was brutal and intimate. Iron on iron, blade against flesh. Richard met them head-on. His white surcoat, stained red with blood, made him look less like a king and more like a revenant. He struck with precision, not fury, every blow a death sentence. "Hold your ground," he shouted, voice ragged but commanding. "Every man fights for Christ or dies for him." Saladin's plan was unraveling. His cavalry, used to overwhelming their enemies, could not break the Crusader wall. Every charge shattered against the disciplined ranks of the Templars and Hospitallers. When Richard saw the Mamluks faltering, he made his move. "Forward," he roared. "Push them back to the sands." The knights surged once more. The clash turned into a rout. Saladin's army, scattered and bleeding, began to withdraw, not in panic, but in grim acknowledgement of defeat. From his distant hill, Saladin watched the retreat, his expression unreadable. "The Lionheart fights like 1,000 men," he murmured. "But even lions must thirst." He turned his horse. "Fall back to the hills. The desert will fight for us now." The Crusaders stood on the field, battered, burned, victorious. But Richard knew this was no end. It was only the beginning of the long road to Jerusalem. The battle was won, but the land itself now became the enemy. The plains around Arsuf reeked of death. The wind carried sand and the stench of rotting flesh. Armor burned the skin, water was scarce, and every step south felt heavier than war. Saladin's army had melted back into the desert, but he was never far. His scouts haunted the Crusader column like shadows. At night, horns sounded in the dunes, reminders that the Sultan was watching. Richard's men were exhausted, wounded, and starving. The wounded begged for water. Horses collapsed mid-march. The king refused to slow down. "If we rest, we die," he told his commanders. Saladin's arrows are patient. Every few miles, the attacks resumed, sudden, sharp, merciless. A column of archers would rise from behind the dunes, shower the Crusaders with arrows, then vanish before a counterattack. The ground was littered with broken shafts and dead men who never saw their killers. The Templars took the front, the Hospitallers the rear, shielding the weaker troops. "No man falls alone," said their Grand Master. "We march as one, or not at all." Saladin's spies reported the Crusaders' suffering. "They are dying slowly," one said. "Shall we strike again?" But Saladin shook his head. "No, let the sun kill them. Let thirst fight in my place." Still, the Crusaders endured. Their faith, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, carried them forward. Richard rode at the head, his armor caked in dust, his lips cracked, but his eyes bright with defiance. He knew Saladin was testing him, bleeding his army without battle. So the Lionheart turned the game. He ordered disciplined night marches, silent movements by moonlight, torches extinguished. The Huns hunted ghosts in the dark while the Crusaders advanced unseen. One dawn, the Christians reached the coast near Jaffa, the gateway to Jerusalem. Behind them, the desert stretched like a grave. Ahead, the blue shimmer of the sea. Richard dismounted, scooped a handful of seawater, and let it run through his fingers. "We've crossed hell," he said. "Now we make the devil regret letting us live." From the dunes behind them, Saladin watched, silent, calculating. He had not been defeated. He was waiting for the next move. And both men knew the true war had only just begun. The city of Jaffa shimmered in the coastal heat, the last fortress before Jerusalem, its white walls scarred by years of siege and salt. For Richard, it was more than a stronghold. It was the key to survival. Whoever held Jaffa controlled the lifeline to the sea, supplies, reinforcements, and escape. When his army reached its gates, the people wept with relief. But their joy was short-lived. Scouts brought grim news. Saladin was gathering his forces again. Tens of thousands, regrouping for one final strike. The Sultan would not allow the Lionheart to rest. Richard immediately set to work. Day and night, the Crusaders rebuilt the fortifications. Engineers repaired the walls, archers took positions along the parapets, and ships from Cyprus arrived with fresh supplies. Every hammer strike echoed like a war drum. In the distance, smoke columns rose. Saladin was coming. Inside the city, Richard walked among his men. "You have fought the desert," he said. "Now fight the man who commands it. This is not about kings or crowns. This is about who deserves to live." The words ignited them. These were men who had marched from Acre, bled at Arsuf, and seen the sea turn red. They were beyond fear. When Saladin's vanguard appeared, the horizon darkened with movement. Thousands of horsemen, archers, and siege engines. The Sultan himself rode at the center, calm, regal, his white robes snapping in the wind. "Tell Richard," he said to a messenger, "that I come to take back what belongs to God." The next morning, the assault began. Arrows fell like rain. Siege towers rolled forward, their wooden skins blazing as Crusader firepots struck them. The walls trembled under rams. Richard fought wherever the danger was greatest, climbing ladders, hurling stones, rallying his men with the fury of 10 soldiers. When the gate nearly gave way, he leapt onto the breach himself, swinging his sword in wide arcs, cutting down any who came close. Blood poured from a wound on his arm, but he fought on, shouting, "Jaffa will not fall while I draw breath." By dusk, the Saracens withdrew, stunned by his ferocity. Saladin watched the smoke rise from the burning towers, eyes narrowed. "The Lionheart," he murmured, "does not fight like a king, but like a man who has nothing left to lose." The walls held barely, and the two greatest warriors of their age were now locked in a duel not of strength, but of will. The siege dragged into days of unbroken torment. Every sunrise brought new attacks, every sunset more dead. The air was thick with smoke and the reek of salt, blood, and rot. Both armies were exhausted, both commanders unyielding. Then, on the 7th day, Saladin tried something different. Under the cover of dawn fog, his elite troops, hand-picked Mamluks and Nubian swordsmen, slipped along the coast, striking the weakest section of Jaffa's wall. Within an hour, they were inside. The city exploded in chaos. Crusader garrisons were overrun. Civilians screamed through the narrow streets. Flaming arrows turned homes into infernos. The defenders fell back toward the citadel, where a handful of knights made their stand. Richard was at sea, resting with a small force aboard ships off the coast, when smoke rose from Jaffa. A messenger swam through the waves to reach him, gasping, "The city is lost. The Saracens are inside." Without hesitation, Richard ordered every ship to shore. "Arm yourselves," he barked. "We take back what's ours now." His men stared. There were barely 50 knights, perhaps 200 sailors, against thousands, but no one disobeyed. They rowed toward the burning harbor under a hail of arrows, leaping from boats into waist-deep surf. Richard himself was first onto the beach, his sword raised, the cross blazing on his chest. "Follow me," he roared. The charge that followed was madness, divine madness. The small band of Crusaders crashed into the Saracen ranks, cutting through them like wildfire. The sudden ferocity stunned Saladin's troops. Panic spread. The Lionheart fought like a man possessed, his sword flashing faster than the eye could follow. Chroniclers later swore he cut down 15 men with his own hand. Others said 20, but every witness agreed that day Richard fought as if God himself had taken flesh. By noon, the impossible had happened. The Saracens were driven from Jaffa, their dead covering the streets. Saladin's army pulled back to the hills, beaten not by numbers, but by sheer will. From his tent, the Sultan watched the smoke curl toward heaven. "Such men," he said quietly, "are born once in 1,000 years." He did not attack again. For the first time, both lions, the Christian and the Muslim, understood that to continue would mean the destruction of both. The swords fell silent. The war had burned itself out. The ruins of Jaffa still smoked when Richard and Saladin finally faced each other. Not on the battlefield, but through envoys and parchment. Both men were exhausted, their armies shattered, their lands bleeding. Yet neither had been defeated. They had tested one another in fire and found an equal. From his golden tent outside Jerusalem, Saladin received Richard's emissaries with dignity. His generals urged him to strike while the Crusaders licked their wounds. But the Sultan only said, "No, the Lionheart fights with God's fury, but even lions die of thirst." In Jaffa, Richard lay on a cot, feverish from his wounds. The surgeons begged him to rest, but he waved them away. "Send word to Saladin," he said. "Tell him I came for Jerusalem, not for slaughter." The negotiations began. Messengers rode between camps under white flags. For weeks, swords were silent, but tension hung thicker than smoke. Both men knew they could not win outright. Jerusalem could be taken, perhaps, but not held. The desert would devour any who tried. At last, an agreement took shape. Christians would keep the coast, from Tyre to Jaffa, while Muslims would retain Jerusalem. But Christian pilgrims, knights or peasants, would be allowed to enter the holy city freely, protected by Saladin's word. When the truce was signed, a strange calm fell over the land. Chroniclers wrote that Saladin rode to the hills overlooking Jaffa and watched the Crusader banners flutter in the sea wind. "This man," he said softly, "would have conquered the world had I not been born." Richard, weak but alive, gazed east toward the horizon where Jerusalem shimmered in the distance. He clenched his fist, then released it. "I came to take a city," he murmured, "but found something greater, a man I could not hate." The two never met face to face, but their respect for one another became legend. Muslim poets called Richard Melek Rik, the king of courage. Western scribes named Saladin the noble enemy. The Third Crusade ended not with conquest, but with an understanding, forged in blood, tested in honor. Two lions had fought, neither had fallen, but both had changed the world. Autumn winds swept across the Holy Land, carrying with them the last echoes of war. The banners of Christ and the crescent still fluttered over their lands, divided yet bound by a peace born of exhaustion and respect. The world had witnessed something rare. Two conquerors who could destroy each other, but chose not to. Richard's army began its long journey north. The men who had survived Arsuf, the last true knights of the crusade, marched in silence. Their armor was cracked, their shields battered, yet their spirits burned with something beyond victory. They had looked into hell and seen honor staring back. In Jaffa's harbor, Richard stood watching the sea. The wounds on his arm and shoulder throbbed, reminders of the desert's cruelty. Beside him, his standard-bearer asked softly, "Will we return, my king, to Jerusalem?" Richard looked toward the east. where the holy city glimmered under the setting sun. "Not I," he said, "but others will, and may they fight with courage, not pride." When word of the truce reached Europe, reactions split the continent. Some called him a coward for not taking Jerusalem. Others called him a saint for saving thousands from meaningless slaughter. But history remembered him differently, not as a conqueror, but as the embodiment of chivalry, a warrior who fought without cruelty and bowed to no man's hatred. In Damascus, Saladin received news that Richard had sailed for home. The Sultan smiled faintly. "A lion returns to his kingdom," he said, "and I to mine, yet we both served the same master, fate." Months later, Saladin himself fell ill. As he lay dying, he ordered all his wealth to be given to the poor. His armor displayed as proof that the greatest ruler of Islam would leave the world with nothing but faith. And far away, in Europe, Richard the Lionheart rode into new wars and betrayals, never again to see the Holy Land, but forever bound to it in memory and myth. The Battle of Arsuf became a symbol, not of conquest, but of endurance, of two worlds colliding and finding, amid blood and dust, a moment of honor that history would never forget. Two lions had roared across the sands of Palestine. When the echoes faded, what remained was not victory, but legend.